Hello everyone and welcome back. It's been a while, hasn't it? I had a lot happen with college in between the last video and this one, and that's part of why this took so long. Another reason is I needed to take a break just to play other things myself for a while there as well, but now that I'm out of college, it's time, I'm ready. Let's finally dive into Trails of Cold Steel 2. If you'd like to support these videos, I have a Patreon you can check out in the description. You'll gain access to videos like this a little bit early and get a shout out in the finished video. Also, if you're interested, I am currently doing streams of Trails Through Daybreak, so be sure to subscribe because some wacky things are happening over there. Also, if you're interested in the streams, I have memberships. Members will gain access to exclusive emotes and badges showing how long you've been subbed, and you can also use those emotes in the comments as well, so hit that up if that interests you. With all that said, let's get into the video. Now, before we get into Trails of Cold Steel 2, I have to talk about the ending of Cold Steel 1. If you have not played Cold Steel 1, I'm about to spoil what is, in my opinion, the best part of the game. In fact, one of the best moments in the entire series. It is basically impossible for me to talk about Trails of Cold Steel 2 without spoiling the first in some fashion, so I'm giving this warning right now. Again, this will be the first Trails review where I will be talking a little more liberally about spoilers, so be warned. Alright, let's begin. So let's rewind for a little bit before I get into the ending. First, I need to briefly talk about the two party members I omitted earlier, as well as the villains of Cold Steel 1. These two party members are Millium Orion and Crow Armbrust. Millium is a child who works for Chancellor Osborne in the Intelligence Division, and she is one of the Ironbloods alongside Captain Claire and Lecter Arundel. She is assigned to the class at the same time as Crow at the start of Chapter 5, though you briefly meet her partway through Chapter 3. She is a loose-lipped girl with a mysterious past and a very energetic personality. Her weapon and partner is a combat shell named Argetlem, or as she calls it, Lammy. Now, fun fact, and I never heard of this until my friend Snive brought it up, but both Millium and another character seem to be inspired by the anime Kami-sama dolls. I never watched the show, but let me know if it's good. Personally, I didn't like Millium much at first, but she really grew on me as the games went along. Now, Crow, on the other hand, is one of my favorite characters in the game. He's a delinquent who scams Reen out of a 50 Mira coin early in the game, and he is an absolute goofball. He's assigned to the class due to his bad grades, and combined with Millium, he adds a lot of life to the group.
And what's up with these little comments in the margins? Optimal bounce vectors? Show them titties? Are you serious?
Lastly, though, are the villains, the Imperial Liberation Front. This is a terrorist group dedicated to taking down Gileath Osborne by any means necessary. Class 7 has small encounters with the ILF throughout the game, as they unravel both their plans and their connection to the Noble faction. There's a lot I could say about these guys, but I'll go into them later in this video since they also play a role in Cold Steel 2. Alright, so let's get into the ending of this game. I will try and truncate this as much as I can, but it's a very long ending and a lot happens, so get comfy guys because stuff is about to get crazy. In the final chapter, Thor's military academy holds their school festival, and in the middle of it, the old schoolhouse goes haywire, leading Class 7 to dive in one last time. Once inside, they discover one of my favorite final dungeons in the series, and I just adore the aesthetic of this place, and I also really love the music here. At this point, Emma seems to know what's going on, but with no time to worry about it, the group pushes through. Deep in the schoolhouse after fulfilling its trials, and by that I mean the final boss, Class 7 finds something you may not expect.
Is that a Gundam?
From here is the longest ending in the entire series, and it is a bit long-winded, but boy is it really cool. From here, the festival continues as normal, as Class 7 holds their rock concert that was built up for half the game, and boy, I really wish this had better production value, especially considering how many RPGs handled these kinds of moments, but I guess Falcom ran out of time. I'm not a fan of this scene. Anyway, at the end of the day, everyone is relaxing, you have your final bonding event, and all seems good in the world. That is, until Claire gets a phone call. Guerrilla Fortress, a place you visited in Chapter 5, has been wiped from existence by an unknown weapon from Crossbell. Class 7 meets up to listen to Chancellor Osborne's address over the radio, as Crow is mysteriously absent. As they listen to the radio, hosted by Misty, Emma suddenly recognizes the voice. I guess Emma had never listened to the radio show? At the same time, Millium realizes something but is too late to stop it. Crow is revealed to be C, the leader of the Imperial Liberation Front. After the ship blew up in Chapter 6, everyone thought C had died, but it's revealed it was a ruse by Crow all this time, meaning Crow is in a perfect position to take his shot.
Well played, Armbrust.
Osborne falls lifeless as Class 7 tries to process what happened. Then, at that moment, through the radio, Misty starts casting a spell, allowing Class 7 to see what is happening in the capital. A giant Noble Alliance airship, similar to the Glorious from Sky's second chapter, drops a bunch of mechs called Panzer Soldats from the sky. These mechs, which remind me a lot of the Nightmare frames from Code Geass, subdue the Reformist armies with ease, taking over the capital. Crow, held at gunpoint, manages to escape inside of a mech of his own, only this one seems similar to the one in the old schoolhouse. It is revealed at this point that Misty, her real name Vita, is an Anguis of Ouroboros? Which is just such an insane reveal, I love it. Class 7 is, understandably, in shock. Emma reveals that Vita was something of a sister of hers, and that what happened was very real. At this point, Fee and Gaius use their super senses to find out that Soldats are approaching the academy. In response to this, Class 7 as well as the faculty rush out to fight the Soldats, and during this moment, Elisa's maid Sharon is revealed to be an enforcer of Ouroboros. What's going on? Though she still seems to be on our side for the time being. Interesting. Rean and friends then go to the other exit of the town, but find themselves quickly backed into a corner by the Soldats, and all seems lost when this happens.
Dost thou desire the power?
This voice.
It looks like all the conditions have finally been met.
Celine, you can talk?
Right now, you need to stay focused. You should know his name already. You saw it deep within the realm of the Great Shadow.
She's right. I remember the name. It feels so familiar. Like I've always known. Heed my call.
Valimar, the Ashen Knight!
Unless you have a death wish, I suggest you get the hell out of here.
Rita's got a freaking mech and its name is Valimar, oh my god! Now when I first saw this scene, as someone who has seen some mecha anime in the past, they absolutely nailed the homage here. Reen calls the thing like Domon from G Gundam, Valimar rides the schoolhouse elevator like it's a mech transport, the cockpit has the vibes to match, it's so good. At this point, the game introduces a totally new combat style we'll talk about later, as Reen subdues the Soldats. However, it's a short-lived victory as Crow makes his arrival to the scene.
A blue knight?
Then Valimar wasn't the only Divine Knight that was awoken.
Why are you doing this? Are you really the one who shot the Chancellor? And where did you even get that thing?
It's thanks to the Imperial Liberation Front's planning that I wound up at the Academy in the first place. Gotta say though, the whole school thing was a lot more fun than I expected. Almost makes me sad to leave it behind. But at the end of the day, I'm C. That's the real deal. The Crow Armbrust you've known all this time, he isn't real. He never was.
Like hell he isn't! All the good times we had? Your friendship with Toa and Angelica and George? You seriously want me to believe that all of that was just a lie? That our hanging out, our field studies, even our concert meant nothing to you?
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
A double saber, just like C used.
Then there's no room left for doubt. Crow really is C.
I take no joy in this, but we can't have that Ashen Knight of yours getting in the way later down the line. So I'm afraid I'm gonna have to bust it up, along with the academy. As for you students and the staff, you'll be under our jurisdiction.
So that's the plan if you win, huh? But what about if I win?
If you win, I'll pay up the interest I owe you on that 50 Mira. Hell, we could even trade places. I'll babble on about friendship and dreams, and you can have fun for once in your life.
You've got yourself a deal. But I hope you know what you just signed up for. Because the Bank of Reen has the highest interest rate on the continent.
Iconic freaking line.
If we'll be trading places, don't forget you'll have a mountain of work waiting for you back at the academy. So one way or another, you'll be coming back with us, Crow.
You've got some real stones. I'll give you that. But sure, I'll agree to those terms.
This is bad.
Their will to fight is causing an enormous outpouring of mana.
Alright, let's do this.
This is actually one of the hardest final bosses in the series, and for not exactly great reasons. On lower difficulties it's really not that bad, but on Nightmare it's kind of based on RNG whether you are going to have a good time or not. There isn't really a good way to heal in this game's version of the mech combat, so you kind of just need to get a lot of good rolls with the staggers in this fight, and it's just not a great time, but I managed to actually do it the first try, so hey, I lucked out in that regard. Regardless, right as Reen thinks he's won, Crow activates his trump card, knocking him down with one blow. Unable to recover, Reen's friends tell him to flee and fight another day, and Celine, Emma's familiar I forgot to mention until now, orders Valimar to fly as far as he can, and thus Reen is forced away from his friends, their fate unknown to him. And that's how the game ends! This is one of the meanest cliffhangers in the series, but man, it is such a risky way to end this game in general. The whole game was about Reen and his friends hanging out, exploring, and field studies, with a political plotline that is built up throughout the game, leading up to this ending, which is basically the pilot episode of a mecha anime, and I love it. Now, I know several people who don't like this ending, but I absolutely respect the heck out of the decision. It smashes all expectations and really gets me hyped for the next game. In regards to the introduction of mechs into the Trails universe, I don't think it actually breaks the universe in the slightest, so this is actually a lot of foreshadowing within the game itself leading up to it, and additionally, in the previous games before this, there actually were quite a number of advanced machinery and mechs present in those games, so I really don't think it's that much of a leap to reach this point. I personally find the introduction of mechs really cool, and I'm really excited to talk about that in the future games. This is also the true defining aspect of the Cold Steel arc I couldn't mention until now. While Sky is inspired by fantasy adventure anime and Crossbell is inspired by crime and political thrillers, Trails of Cold Steel is the mecha anime of the series, and I am here for it. But now that we finally have the ending of the first game out of the way, it's finally time we talk about Trails of Cold Steel 2, and you guys have no idea how excited I am to talk about this one. Trails of Cold Steel 2 is one of my favorite games in the series. Yes, the whole series. Now this game definitely has its detractors, so you might be wondering why I like this one so much. Well, considering that's part of why I even bothered making this video, let's get into it. I said before that Cold Steel 1 is one of the weirdest games in the series, and I'd say that Cold Steel 2 is equally weird in some regards, but also a return to form in others. Following up on the last game's ending, Trails of Cold Steel 2 completely does away with the school setting, and instead takes on a much more traditional game structure. Emphasis on more traditional? I'll go into that in a bit. Much like Trails in the Sky second chapter and Trails to Azure, you can transfer your save data and the game will remember which character you had your final bonding event with, as well as a number of smaller things. Worth mentioning that this doesn't transfer as much as second chapter or Azure did, but it's still cool. Now before I go into the story, I'm going to have to let you guys know that I'm going to be handling this a little bit different than usual. I usually try to make these as spoiler free as possible, but given some of the writing decisions of this game, I'm going to have to bend that rule at least a little bit. So here's what I'm going to do. At the very end of this video, I'm going to have a massive spoiler section where I will go over the story in detail, talking about everything I liked and disliked. At that point, I'm going to be assuming you guys have played both this game and the rest of the series, so pay attention if you're trying to avoid spoilers, though if you guys do want to go ahead and play through the games and come back to this video later, I will totally understand, no hard feelings. So with that in mind, let's get into the premise. This game opens up with Rean asleep in the Isengard mountain range near his hometown of Ymir. Rean is awoken by Celine, who informs him that he nearly died in his fight with Crow, and that as a result he's been asleep for a month, kept alive by his new mech, the Ashen Knight Valimar. After learning this information, Rean tries to make his way back to his hometown, determined to find some way to go back to Trista and see what happened to his friends. And during this stretch, we are given slightly more info on Emma, who has secretly been a witch this whole time, with Celine being her familiar. On the way back to Ymir, we also meet Princess Alphen, Toval, and Rean's stepsister Elise. In Ymir, we are given an update on the current situation. Using their soldats, most of the country has been taken over by the noble faction, and the fate of most of the Thor's students are largely unknown. Stuck with very little information to go on, Rean is left to process what happened and what to do. Remember how I mentioned the Cold Steel 1 drama CD? Well, in this section we get to explore Rean's hometown of Ymir, and it's really neat. Now the really weird thing is that this game actually references the drama CD at several points, which is certainly a unique choice. Luckily it's not crucial to fully understand the story or anything, but if you've never listened to it, then there's definitely going to be some confusion in a handful of scenes. Now surely this will be the last time this arc pulls something like this, right? It is also during this stretch that we see how Rean copes with the idea of failing his friends. I mentioned that Rean struggles a lot with his self-worth, and he really beats himself up in the intro here. This is also the point where the series really starts to poke at this character flaw of his, and it continues to be a trend over the course of the game. At the end of the prologue, Vita as well as the new character Altina arrive in Ymir. During this sequence, they kidnap Elise as well as Princess Alphen, leaving Rean with the objective of not only reuniting with his friends, but also to rescue Alphen and Elise from the Noble Alliance.
Hang in there, you two! I'm coming for you! I promise!
Okay, I'm kidding. But alright, now that we have the premise out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about what really makes this different from Cold Steel 1. This game is a bit of a radical shift from the last one from a pacing perspective. Because there are no school sections to be seen, the plot of this game moves very quickly and doesn't really spend a lot of time on the characters and world building compared to before. In fact, if you only stick to the story, this might be one of the fastest paced games in the series. Following up on the last game's ending though, that makes complete sense. This game raises the stakes significantly as the noble faction has taken a massive amount of control over the country, as they have several armed skirmishes with the reformists throughout the story. Meanwhile, Rean and Class 7 represent a third faction of sorts. While he is often allied with the reformists, he navigates the country searching for his friends, with the game changer being Rean's own mech Valimar, a divine knight of legend capable of defeating any soldat with ease, and I really dig this setup. It is worth mentioning though that as a third faction, this plot is a lot more concerned with minimizing the bloodshed in this conflict. You don't participate on the front lines, but rather you are there to step in if things go too far. Now I know some people were definitely disappointed by this direction, but I think it makes complete sense knowing who we're following in this game. Moving on from that, what makes this game unique, outside of the mechs, is the structure. This is the first Trails game to abandon the chapter-to-chapter structure in favor of a 2-act structure. Each act is paced very differently from each other, both from a gameplay and story standpoint. Act 1 being the fastest, most linear stretch, while Act 2 has the bulk of this game's content. Each of these acts can be broken down into smaller parts, each of them being like mini Trails chapters. I think the fascinating thing about this game is that as a follow-up to Cold Steel 1, this game is paced faster than pretty much any of the sequel games before it. In fact, it's so fast-paced that the main cast doesn't get as much focus this time. Some characters such as Eustace and Sarah do, which is fantastic, but a majority of the game is focused mainly on Rean and the main plot. That said, if you're wanting more time with the characters, you may want to look to the bonding events. Functionally, the bonding events work the same as the last game, only the quality of them was enhanced across the board. In Cold Steel 1, the vast majority of them were just two heads talking without much going on, and while there's still definitely ones like that in Cold Steel 2, I found them far more enjoyable in this game. Now, personally, this might be my Fire Emblem background talking again, but I actually don't mind the character moments in this being optional, since, as I mentioned before, most of the characters in this got plenty of development in the last game. That said, there are some genuinely great moments you could potentially miss out on here. I personally recommend Eusis, Sarah, Millium, and Emma's bonding events since it really helps to flesh them out, and it also enhances some plot beats in the game. Emma's bonding events expand her backstory and her history with Vita, and it also fleshes out her arc, so I definitely recommend hers. Eusis gets a lot of great stuff in this game since his family are leading members of the Noble faction, and in general, this is the game that cemented Eusis as one of my favorite Cold Steel characters. Sarah also gets her backstory expanded upon, as well as some great moments in the story too, and her bonding events also have one of her best quotes, "Absolutely love Sarah." Now for Millium, I think it's actually important for reasons I'll go into in the spoiler section, but there's some genuinely great setup there and I think it's definitely worth experiencing. Now let's briefly talk about the bonding events a little bit more broadly. While I do think there are some really great character moments, I think there's also some really good slice of life stuff too. I mentioned this in Cold Steel 1, but there's a bonding event in this game where Laura breaks a bunch of appliances in a store, and I just thought it was really cute. Also, there's one bonding event with Gaius where we meet his new bird. This one is cool because it unlocks a craft for him early, and not many bonding events do stuff like this, so if that interests you, definitely do this one. Okay, so this take may bother some people, but I think the decision to make these character moments optional is what allows Cold Steel 2's plot to be as snappy as it is. If the game had to cram in story moments and development for all 10 characters into the plot, then it would take forever for anything to happen in the plot as it currently stands. Overall, while I do see people's issues with the bonding events in this game, I think it was the right decision and it does add a lot of replayability. Something I do find questionable though is that you still have limited points to spend. Now for me it wasn't that big of a deal since I just reloaded my save to view them all, but if you're replaying the game there's a New Game Plus option to give you infinite bonding points, or alternatively you could just load your save over and over and then pick your favorites. I've also seen friends hack these games to get this perk, so I suppose you could also do that. I'll say that this system does exist to incentivize replays, but it does potentially lock you out of bonding events, and not everyone is crazy enough to replay these games like I do, so it is worth mentioning. While I would say that this system doesn't really bother me as much as a lot of people, the bonding point system doesn't really go away after this game, so we'll go ahead and just move on. Last game I spent quite a bit of time talking about the main characters, so this time I want to talk about the villains. And by the way, just like the main cast, there are quite a lot of them. Let's start with the Society of Ouroboros who returned from previous games. From Ouroboros is Blue Blanc, Duvali the Swift, Vita, as well as the new character McBurn, one of the edgiest and strongest people in the series. Blue Blanc is a returning character from previous games and has been the culprit responsible for a number of side quests throughout the series. And he is just as much of a ham as always. I love this man to death. I've avoided mentioning him before due to spoilers, but I really love his rivalry with Olivier and that gets some fun nods in this game. Duvali was a minor character that originally appeared in Crossbell and she has more of a role this time. Her defining trait is that she has the biggest temper in the series and has a design that reminds me a lot of Nero from the Fate franchise. They also do some great stuff with her over the course of the Cold Steel games, so definitely keep an eye out for that. Vita being revealed as an Anguisse is such a fun reveal in Cold Steel 1, and she continues to be a pretty decent antagonist in this game. In fact, she manages to be pretty spooky in a lot of scenes, which is crazy considering the same character was my favorite radio host. As mentioned before, she also has some connections to Emma that are explored in her bonding events, so do those if you can. McBurn is an interesting case. Despite him having an admittedly goofy name, McBurn is probably one of the strongest people in the entire Trails series, and he has a really cool scene I'll talk about in the spoiler section. He's also probably the closest the Cold Steel series has to the Super Boss archetype, so be careful not to get burned. Then there's Zephyr with Zeno and Leo. Zephyr is the Jaeger Corps that Fie originally belonged to before joining Class 7, and they were the rivals of the Red Constellation from the Crossbell games. However, something I really like about these two characters is that they are surprisingly chill. Zeno and Leo are here to help the Alliance because it's their job at the end of the day, but there's no malice or evil in them, which is not how I would have described the Red Constellation, who were actual psychopaths. Overall, I like these guys. Another new character is Altina, a mysterious girl with a combat shell similar to Millium. She's very deadpan and robotic, but gets some really cool development in future games, and in fact is probably one of the most beloved characters in the entire arc, but I'll talk about that later. Now from the noble side of things are Rufus Alborea, his father Duke Alborea, as well as Duke Cayenne. Rufus is Eustace's brother and is framed as a really cool and chill guy the first time you meet him in Cold Steel 1, but coming back to that game after playing this one, it's clear that something was up. After the end of the last game, he is now the Noble Faction's chief tactician, and I really like that, and it sets up a lot of great drama for Eustace. In fact, even more drama for Eustace is his dad, who is one of the most despicable people in the entire series. I hate this man, he's a terrible father, only cares about power and being on top, and in general is just a bad dude. I feel so bad for Eustace, man. Then, of course, there's Duke Cayenne, who is the main villain of this game. Now, I've heard some people say he is the weakest villain in the series, and he's definitely down there, but I think he works perfectly for the kind of plot this game is going for. Duke Cayenne basically represents everything wrong with the Noble Faction in a single character. The big problem is that he barely has any screen time, but I think despite that, he is a pretty solid villain. And lastly, we have the Imperial Liberation Front. The members of this organization are Vulcan, Scarlet, the now deceased Gideon, and the man himself, Crow. The ILF was formed with the sole purpose of killing Chancellor Osborn, and with their goal met, we now get to see how they move on. I like Vulcan and Scarlet, but my favorite of them by far is Crow. It's hard for me to say who exactly are my favorite Trails characters because there are so many good ones, but Crow is definitely up there. Having this chill dude you met in Cold Steel 1, a guy that was genuinely fun to play as and helped to bring life to the group, be secretly the leader of the villains you encountered throughout that game was really fun, and I adore this twist. This game fully establishes Crow as Reen's main goal and rival. More than anyone, Crow is the one Reen really wants to bring home, but to defeat him, Reen has to grow and get better at piloting Valimar, and it's a classic anime setup, but I love it. Meanwhile, Crow, after fulfilling his life goal, is just concerned with just ending the war as soon as possible and seeing his path to the end. I find Reen and Crow's dynamic really compelling, and it really is at the heart of this game's narrative. To go back to the story, I have noticed that this game has probably one of the more criticized plots in the series, notably Act 2, which I've seen many refer to as filler. I'll go into why it is not later in my spoiler section, but I think there's a lot of aspects of this game's plot where I feel a lot of people miss the point in my opinion. Speaking personally, while this doesn't have my favorite plot in the series, I feel this has a refreshing simplicity to it. A lot of games in the series really like to take their time in their cutscene direction, and more often than not just have no problem being slow. And I feel like people think Cold Steel 2 is padded because it has some of the most optional content of the 4 Cold Steel games, which is something I will talk about shortly, but the actual story of this game is refreshingly snappy and it makes sense to me. It pretty much feels like a specific stretch from Azure, and I'm really confused by the hate. This isn't to say anyone is wrong per se for feeling how they do, this is just a case of this being one area where I really cannot relate to large portions of the community. Back in 2021, I was burnt out by Cold Steel 1 and just wanted things to happen in the story, and when I got to Cold Steel 2 and realized it had the exact opposite pacing, I was in love with it. And a lot of that was the gameplay, but I did genuinely love the simpler story. Now, I do want to elaborate on a point I made back in Cold Steel 1. Many people have cited Cold Steel 1 as an effective jumping on point, but my one problem with that was Cold Steel 2. Given that game's cliffhanger, it is incredibly likely a newcomer will jump to this game, which is where my problem lies. There are sections of this game that will spoil events from the previous Trails games, to a degree that there is one section of this game meant entirely for longtime fans. This is actually the #1 reason why I can't really recommend Cold Steel 1 and 2 as someone starting games, but I'll go into that in the spoiler section. Like I said in Cold Steel 1, I really don't mean to gatekeep, but I do feel like this will only lead to problems in the long run. I'm just trying to look out for all of you. But alright, before we wrap up this story section, I have one more thing for those of you who are dodging spoilers. Like with Cold Steel 1, the final chapter of this game is a banger, having some of the coolest moments in the entire series, with one section in particular having me hype screaming. If you know, you know. But again, we'll go into that later. With all of that said, let's finally dive into the gameplay, which is where the real meat of this game lies. The overworld exploration in this game is more or less the same as before, only this time it is a little more streamlined and fleshed out. A big change from the last game, as I'm sure you've guessed, is that the school sections are completely gone in this game, and in their place are rest days. Rest days are basically this game's equivalent to the free days from the first game, featuring small quests and bonding events. Though, in comparison, these are far more bite-sized, which actually made them much less of a slog for me personally. In Act 1, these rest days take place in Reen's hometown of Ymir, which acts as your base, while in Act 2, these rest days take place in different locations, providing a change of scenery. I actually love Ymir a lot in Act 1. It's way smaller than Thor's for one, but it also features a nearby area where you can test your party combinations, and a fun detail is that this town also features a snowboard minigame. In this minigame, you have to slide down some slopes, collecting flags within a specific time frame. This is a really simple minigame, but it's a fun distraction with some good rewards. My only problem with this minigame is that the controls are a little bit jank, but outside of that I spent a whole lot of time playing it and I can't recommend it enough. However, snowboarding is not the only minigame. Blade returns in this game, now retitled as Blade 2. This version of the game adds a few more cards, allowing for better strategic play, and can be played freely with your party members to build link points. While I would still not call this minigame deep or anything, it is a fun distraction and I like it. Fishing, to the surprise of no one, returns in this game, and it is pretty much unchanged from the last game. I'll add that there is a subplot to the fishing again, just like Azure, which is great. While I still think I prefer Azure's questline by a country mile, this fishing quest has some really fun moments with a really great payoff at the end. But alright, now that we have the small stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and go into the game loop, starting with the act structure. In Act 1, the game is paced a lot closer to the field studies overall. There are quests, academic points, NPCs to talk to, books to obtain, monster chests, etc. Something I like a lot about Act 1 is they can stumble upon some spirit shrines. These are dungeons you cannot fully explore until later, but if you do it right away, you'll get some lore as well as academic points. These dungeons are similar to the schoolhouse dungeon from the first game, and I think they are really neat. While they are still not on the level of Golden Sun or anything, they are probably the most fun dungeons since the Crossbell games. They also add a lot of lore and context to the story, so I definitely recommend you do them when they're available. Now, on the topic of the dungeons in this game, I may as well bring up a feature of Cold Steel 2, vent crawling.
I'm gonna vent!
In this game, if you see a vent, you can crawl through it to reach new areas and also get some flavor text.
Come on, who cares if the boys get a sneak peek of your panties?
Stay classy, Falcom. The funny thing is, you can tell Falcom is very proud of this addition because vents are everywhere in this game. To a degree that I sometimes question why these buildings are designed this way. Still, it does change things up and segments off parts of dungeons, which does push some navigational skills, so I like them. Moving on for the dungeons, one of my favorite things about Act 1 are the guest party members, the first of which is Toval, and they are all kind of busted. However, my favorite thing about them is their accessories. At the start of Act 2, the guest character you have the most bonding points with will give you an accessory, two of which are pretty dang useful. I have noticed the popular choice is to go for the Black Virtue for Reen, since it increases his ability to delay enemies, but since Fee's Master Quartz largely serves the same purpose, that's why I prefer Toval's. Toval's accessory cuts casting time down to 1/3, and it immediately made all spellcasters much more viable, and I was able to swap it around my party composition with ease. Cerulean Hearts, though, is by far the worst accessory, giving an increase in accuracy and crit. It's not a bad accessory. In fact, I think if you combine it with Murakumo, having extra crit is really nice and would be especially effective on Laura. The thing is, compared to the other two, it is definitely the least viable. Worth mentioning that you can only get one of these accessories per playthrough, so be sure to choose wisely. Since these characters don't really stick around, I think it's actually really cool that they did this, since it helps to reward you for actually spending time with them. I also think it adds a little bit of personality to everyone's playthroughs, so I think that's really neat. I'm really curious what characters you all went for, so feel free to comment that down below. Also random, but during Act 1 you meet this character named, oh my god, it's Miles, oh my god!
Cameo time!
Remember Miles, the receptionist from Ring of Judgment who was in like 2 pages? Wears glasses? Well, he's here running the Bracer Guild in Legram. It really shows just how absolutely wild Falcom is that they chose to cameo such an insanely obscure character from a manga very few people read into only one game. That's right, this is the only game he shows up in. Still, it's fun to see him and he gives you quests, he still wears glasses. I don't know why he's here. Anyway, that was a bit of a tangent, so let's go ahead and go back to the gameplay. Act 2 is where the real meat of the gameplay lies, but for me to go into it, I'm going to have to give a spoiler disclaimer for it, so if you guys do not want any spoilers for the gameplay whatsoever, please go ahead and skip this timestamp right here, and I'll see you guys when I'm done talking about Act 2. Alright, so let's get into it. During Act 2, you gain access to an airship called the Courageous. Using this airship, you can freely travel across eastern Erebonia, or at least part of it. As previously established, most of eastern Erebonia is under Noble Faction control at the start of Act 2. This means that at the start of the act, there's not many places you can visit. However, as you progress through the act, more areas open up, giving you more and more freedom, which I really like. Additionally, you can gain access to a bike that allows you to travel all over the game at a faster speed, which is pretty rad. However, the defining aspect of Act 2 is that you can actually find various students of Thor's military academy from the first game and recruit them to the ship. And every student unlocks a facility on the Courageous. These include upgrades for Valimar, training facilities, an item lottery, the ability to ride horses anywhere, as well as several NPCs who reward you for collecting dishes, scanning enemies, and many, many more. This is often compared to the Suikoden series and is one of my favorite things about Cold Steel 2. The base building is fantastic for adding a gameplay value to each of the students, and it really endeared me to these minor characters. One thing you can unlock are training facilities where you can complete combat challenges. The difficulty for these can be kind of all over the place, with the magic challenge being my least favorite. That said, this is actually the best way to farm U materials in the game, and on New Game Plus you can spend U materials to get Zemurian ore shards, which are needed for the ultimate weapons. Great addition. This game also gives you the freedom to just explore most of Eastern Erebonia on the bike if you want to, which I don't advise because there is a perfectly good fast travel system. However, I do think it would make for an excellent voting campaign. Vote for Toa!
The Hexa Toa.
Toa for president. Toa, Toa.
Is that Reed Schwarzer?
Also, and this is really fun, during Act 2 you can challenge some super bosses. These fights are some of the more difficult fights in the game and are available until the end of the act. If you fight them right away, especially on Nightmare, you are likely to get dunked, but they are very doable. And when you defeat them, you are rewarded with a lost art. What is a lost art? Well, I'll go into that in the combat section. But man, I just want to say that I adore Act 2. In most Trails games, they are very aggressively linear and story-driven, which is definitely not a bad thing, but I think it is important for a series to change things up here or there, and I think this game is very effective at that. This is a game that is brimming with all sorts of side content and fun activities, and is the point where you can really let loose with your party building and customization. I also already said this, but I adore the student recruitment system. Recruiting a student and then seeing a facility open up on the ship just kind of hits me right in the dopamine, and I really cannot describe it. Speaking of which, aside from character profiles, which is something I will have a whole lot to talk about later in this video, this game has probably the least missables of the entire arc. Now I still think you should use a guide if you can, but I actually was able to play most of Act 2 without one, which is a rarity. In general, I think Act 2 is actually really forgiving with missables compared to most of the series. For example, many of the recipes can be obtained anytime during Act 2, you can return to every fishing location in the game anytime you want to, and outside of a few select dungeons, you can actually find chests pretty much anytime you want to throughout the game. In this regard, Act 2 feels like a very welcome return to the Crossbell games, which I really appreciate. The big takeaway I want you guys to have about this game is the sheer breadth of things you can do and unlock. Especially in Act 2, there's just so much to do and work towards, and I absolutely love that. Additionally, there's other stuff I'll talk about in the spoiler section that makes this game have some of my favorite overall gameplay in the entire series, but I'll explain why later. Regardless though, I think that's enough about Act 2. Let's get into the combat, starting with the shiny new addition, the Divine Night Battles.
Heed my call.
Valimar, the Ashen Knight!
Acknowledged.
Alright, you ready?
We were briefly introduced to this combat during the last game's final boss, but it's been refined significantly this time around. That said, this combat is substantially simpler than the regular combat, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. In Divine Night Battles, the opponent you are fighting has 3 joints you can attack. Each of those joints has a different stagger rate, with some joints punishing you if you go for them. As the fights progress, enemy stances change, and when those stances change, their weak spots move with them. As a result, you spend a lot of these fights trying to figure out their weak spots, and it very much does devolve into trial and error, though luckily you do have other options. Like with the regular combat, you have a craft point meter. While there are no S-crafts in this combat, filling up your craft points is still very important since regular crafts can help a lot on higher difficulties, notably Morning Moon and Heavenly Strike. Morning Moon allows you to dodge every single incoming attack with a guaranteed counterattack, which is incredibly useful when backed into a wall. Heavenly Strike is the most expensive craft, however it has a guaranteed stagger and stuns the target for their next action. Early in the game you unlock Combat Links, which allows for a single party member at a time to assist you during mech fights. And every character has a personalized set of spells that are very helpful during a fight. Sarah debuffs attack and speed, Machias accelerates your turn, Milliam gives a perfect guard, Gaia sacrifices HP for craft points, etc. Most importantly, you can swap these characters in and out during their turns, and it definitely was really useful. Additionally, all of these characters have the ability to restore your HP, EP, and craft points, though restoring HP and craft points requires EP, so be careful when to do these actions. Going back to the stagger system, as you stagger enemies, much like the regular combat, you can follow up to get Brave points. When you have enough Brave points, you can spend them on Valimar's special or a team attack with your linked teammate. These fights are also a really good way to earn link points with a character, since the person you are linked with at the end of a fight gets a huge boost in their link points, so keep that in mind. That said, my biggest problem with this combat is that it's very simplistic. It doesn't show up very often, which means it does lean into spectacle more than actual substance, but I think it's fun. The good news is this combat system gets refined substantially in the next game, but it is a fun set piece when it appears. But in regards to this game, I feel like this game's combat shines the most on Nightmare mode. Since you only have a handful of options, you really want to make your actions count, and so because of that, I really recommend it on Nightmare. While these fights are nowhere near as complex or fun as the regular combat, I think they make up for it in sheer spectacle, and they do a really good job of changing things up. But alright, it's finally time. You guys already know what's coming. Let's go ahead and talk about the regular combat, because this is the one I've been waiting to talk about the most. As per tradition for a Trails sequel, mechanically this game works pretty much the same as Cold Steel 1, though there's a drastic shift in the balancing with a few new features that change things up. So let's get into them. The first change is that this game uses the 2-slot ornaments like the Sky sequels and the Crossbell games. I made it clear that I prefer the 2-slot system, so great start. In terms of new stuff though, there's only a few additions, with each of them being a representation of something from Azure. These additions are Lost Arts and Overdrive. Let's start with the Lost Arts, which is basically this game's equivalent to Azure's Master Arts. As mentioned earlier, you obtain Lost Arts from Act 2 super bosses, and they are incredibly powerful spells. However, they can only be used once per battle and at default take away your entire EP meter, but each of them have some really wacky effects. These spells can do things such as healing you far above your HP cap, accelerating your entire party with 2 back-to-back turns for the caster, and a powerful attack spell that gives a number of debuffs to the enemy. However, the biggest downside to Lost Arts is that they have an incredibly long casting time, often being a risky move when done at the wrong time, a downside that can be rendered moot by the next addition, Overdrive. In the last game, I mentioned that they removed the burst ability from Trails to Azure, and Overdrive is basically Cold Steel's equivalent of it. During fights, you have a little orb meter that fills up during combat, and when it's full, you can activate Overdrive. When Overdrive is active, the party member you are linked with gets an immediate turn, and you get an additional turn after them. And once you start Overdrive, all attacks unbalance, and all spells get immediate turns, including the Lost Arts. This is actually an incredibly broken mechanic that can even be used as an accelerate method, and can even be used in conjunction with the Macia strat to get an absurd amount of turns. Additionally, you can intentionally cancel it either by swapping with the character in the back or linking with someone else, which is actually an insane strat I made a lot of use of. During Act 2, you also unlock a second Overdrive meter, and that alone opens up a lot of combo potential. But on the topic of Overdrive, let's go ahead and talk about the Trial Chest. At default, Reen is the only character that your party can use Overdrive with, so if you want to use Overdrive with the others, that's where the Trial Chests come in. In addition to the usual monster chests, there are now blue chests. These chests require you to use a specific combination of characters to fight off a group of enemies. Completing trial chests allows the relevant characters to perform Overdrive with each other, so if you want to optimize your strategies, then it's very important to do these. But overall, I really like the trial chests. It was nice having an extra thing to look for while exploring, and it also helped to spice up the combat and help me to get creative. And in general, it really forced me to learn how the characters work and how they complement each other, and I really like that. Now, it is worth mentioning that while I love the trial chests, some of them can be kind of rough on Nightmare. However, I do like how many fights are designed around the characters' movesets, and it feels very satisfying to complete them. And also, there's a really sick track that plays when you do these, but I'll talk about that in the soundtrack section. But alright, let's get into the balance of this game because it is a radical shift from the last one. In Cold Steel 1, I mentioned that it tended to be very restrictive, but towards the end when everything was available, it felt like the balance finally started to shift in your favor. Well, Cold Steel 2 takes that endgame balance and runs all the way with it. To begin, remember how I said that the members of Class 7 were on par with the Special Support section in Trails from Zero? Well, Cold Steel 2 starts them off at the power level they were at the end of the last game, and from there they only get more busted. Eustace learns Platinum Guard, a craft that can give perfect guard to party members in range. Fee has an inherently high dodge rate, and with minimal effort you can turn her into a dodge queen. Laura can still do insane damage to bosses if you build her correctly. Macia still has his accelerate craft, but it's even more abusable because of Overdrive, and the list goes on and on. In fact, to elaborate on Fee, let's go ahead and talk about dodge tanking. I alluded to this in my crossbow video, but chose to wait till this game to go into it. Ever since Trails from Zero, when you dodge an attack, it allows you to counterattack. The ability to dodge attacks is purely determined by an evade stat, and the higher the number, the higher your chance to dodge. If you have accessories such as evergreens, it doesn't take much work to build up a dodge tank, especially for Fee who can quite easily reach 100% evade. This of course won't let you dodge spells, but it is nonetheless very helpful. However, Cold Steel 2 pushes it one step further with the Wrath Quartz. This quartz makes every single counterattack a crit, and by extension gives you guaranteed follow-up attacks, giving you easy brave points. With this quartz, you can legit throw Fee with 100% evade at an enemy and just watch the show. It is absolutely nuts. Now later on, Fee also learns a move that gives stealth. Now stealth is not at its best in this game, but its main perk is that it gives a guaranteed critical hit when attacking. Meaning I had a 1-2 strat with Fee a few times where I'd activate her stealth move and follow up with an S-craft to maximize damage. This status was originally created in Crossbell, but it has a unique value in Cold Steel since crits give unbalance. And boy, I will definitely have a lot more to say about this in Reverie in particular. A new addition to the main roster is Sarah. She was briefly playable in sections of the last game, but since Crow left our party for obvious reasons, she is our replacement. In general, Sarah is a character I feel like I really didn't understand how to use when I first played the game, but funny enough, I feel like after doing my replay, I feel like Sarah might actually be a better dodge tank than Fee. She doesn't have stealth, but she has a self buff move that gives insight status, immediately buffing her dodge rate. She also has a lot of really good debuffs, notably delay and seal, which is really nice. Sarah also has a craft that pulls enemies into one spot, and if you give her a quartz that gives enemies movement debuffs, then it basically becomes dark matter, and if you guys know that spell, then you guys know how good this craft is. Sarah is, to my surprise, one of the best characters in the game. Now let's talk about Reen, who is by far the most busted character of the entire cast. Now there's 3 main reasons for this, the first of which is spoilery, so I'll go into that later, so for now let's go ahead and talk about the other 2 reasons. First, Reen can unlock the ability to call Valimar during regular combat, and it's really cool. If you've played Final Fantasy X, it's sort of similar to Yuna's summons from that game. This craft swaps out the entire party with Valimar, who has all of his moves from the Divine Knight battles. A downside to using this is that you can only do this once per battle, and Valibro only sticks around for 3 turns, but it's pretty handy if you need to take a hit or want to cancel something the boss is doing. But it's just a fun inclusion that never really comes back, unfortunately. The second thing about Reen is that he kind of snaps this game in 2. Something that Reen inherited from Joshua in the Sky games is that he has quite a few delay crafts. In Cold Steel 1 it was useful, but in this game it is absolutely busted. Very few enemies resist it, and with the right moves you can kind of power combo. In fact, there was a whole other side to Cold Steel 1's combat I lightly touched on because there was already so much there. But Cold Steel 1 revamped how ailments work. In Sky and the Crossbell games, enemies flat out resisted ailments, but in the Cold Steel games they have varying levels of resistance, meaning that all enemies are technically vulnerable to ailments, but some may resist them more than others. That's about as deep as I'll go with this, but it's a very cool change. Overall, the combat of this game is insanely fun, and if you love to experiment around and make combos, this is one of the best games in the series in that regard. Though if you're wanting a challenging experience, you might want to throw some things on a ban list. Overall, I really love the balance of this game. It's so insanely fun building characters and parties and just trying to snap the game in 2. And in general, if you are here for the gameplay, then Cold Steel 2 is one of the best games in the series for that, and I really cannot recommend it enough. But alright, I think we've talked enough about the gameplay of this game, so let's go ahead and move on to the presentation and soundtrack. Alright, so before I continue, I want to make a correction about Cold Steel 1. I poorly communicated this in my original script, but in the original Japanese dub, Reen, for whatever reason, is not voiced in several scenes in this game, even in scenes where other characters are, which, considering he is our main character, it's more than a little distracting. I think the Japanese cast does a great job, but it's a very odd choice. There's no actual evidence to my knowledge confirming why this choice was made. There's a lot of speculation that Koki Uchiyama was significantly more expensive than the rest of the cast, but I don't believe that's actually been confirmed. Anyway, just know that if you play sub, the Reen will have way less voice lines than everyone else. It's dumb, but let's go ahead and get back to the video. Alright, so let's talk about the presentation. I'm going to keep this short because it's pretty much the same as the last game. Cold Steel 2 released 1 year after the first game in 2014 for the PlayStation Vita, and as you can tell uses the same engine, visuals, and most of the same locations, which is pretty standard for a Trail sequel. The English cast also continues to do a fantastic job across the board, and it felt a little more polished this time around. I didn't go into this before, but there was one scene in the last game where pretty much everyone was voiced except for Mueller, which was super distracting. However, I'm really glad to report that there were no scenes like that in this game, which is really good. However, the sub has pretty much all of the same issues as the first game. Reen still barely has any lines, there's no subtitles for the battle quotes, and there's less overall voice acting than the dub. Additionally, the first cutscene of the game actually has no subtitles whatsoever. Luckily, it's just a recap of the ending of the first game, but it's more than a little bit distracting. Still, as I mentioned before, I did eventually get used to it, and I really like the anime feel of the Japanese cast. And while he doesn't have as many lines as the rest of the cast, I really like the way Koki Uchiyama calls Valimar. It hits me right in the G Gundam.
Koi! Hai no Kishin! Valimar!
That said, I don't have that much more to say about the presentation, so we'll go ahead and move on to the soundtrack because it is once again amazing. I know, shocker. This is a soundtrack I don't actually hear that many people talk about, but for me it's one of my favorites. The music is far more serious and intense this time around, with a lot of rock and epic orchestration in the battle themes, as well as an oppressive atmosphere throughout much of the game to match the tone of the plot. Let's start with Still Countryside, the song that plays when you first arrive in Ymir, perfectly capturing Rein's mental state after the end of the last game. Alongside that track is this game's regular battle theme, Heated Mind, created by the man himself, Takahiro Unasuga. I also love the increase in electronic music during the mech combat sections, once again composed by Unasuga, and it just psychs me up. Another one of my favorites is Bring Up Trust, which plays whenever you do a trial chess battle. This is another track created by Falcom band JDK, and it gets me pumped up every single time. Though speaking of Falcom band, every single game before this replaced the chess battle themes, but this game knew Tai Link of Arceus was so good that they just decided to use the super arranged version, and I'm not gonna complain, I love Tai Link of Arceus. Then there's the opening theme Senko no Yukue, which translates to Where the Light Flashes. Fun fact, Trails of Cold Steel's Japanese title Sen no Kiseki roughly translates to Trails of a Flash. This actually has some narrative payoff in the later games, but I'm definitely tangenting here. This song pumps me up for the adventure and I never get tired of listening to it, and it's one of my favorite opening themes of the entire arc. It is fantastic. The last song I want to mention is probably one of my favorites of the batch. I present the battle theme of the Noble Alliance, Severe Blow.
Well, let's get started.
Show us what you can do.
I'll handle it.
This song features a really fast BPM and a sick melody that just pumps me up every time I fight the Noble Alliance. I think my favorite part of this track is that it uses the opening and ending riffs of Fateful Confrontation from 2nd chapter, and considering Ouroboros members are involved in the Noble Alliance, I love that touch. In general, I feel like this is Unasuga's game since he really steals the show here, having created most of the tracks I just listed. Well, once again, Crossbell's the clear winner for me in terms of soundtrack. This is actually my favorite behind those games. This game brings me that Unasuga Asuka goodness and has a lot of tracks I will definitely talk about in the spoiler section. Fantastic job, Falcom, you did it again, you mad lads. Alright, so we have a few more topics to talk about before we go into spoilers, so let's go ahead and talk about the completion process. I'm going to be talking about both Cold Steel 1 and Cold Steel 2 since the completion process for both of these is pretty similar. Let's start with Cold Steel 1. Now, I didn't platinum this game like I did Crossbell, therefore I won't go too in depth with it. That said, I did most things, so I have some idea of what you'd have to do. Cold Steel 1 is by far the more linear game of the two, never letting you return to any region, and this of course means that there's substantially more missables than Crossbell before it. Now, the good news is, unlike Crossbell, the trophies are no longer baked into the game, meaning that you can totally ignore the achievement hunting now. Now, that isn't to say that this game doesn't want you to engage in the side content though, as the school faculty will now reward you for doing them. This includes quests, enemy scans, recipes, fishing, and the character profiles. The good news is that you don't need to 100% the character profiles or the enemy logbook to get these rewards, but overall though, the reason I didn't bother completing this one is due to how many missables there are. Luckily you can obtain copies of Red Moon Rose from the pawn shop if you miss them, but for things like chests and enemy scans you kind of need to be on alert the entire game. So in this regard, Cold Steel 1 is a hard regression to Sky 1 and 2 and I'm not really a fan of that. As for Cold Steel 2 though, well, I told you guys I like this game. Back in 2021, I played this game twice back to back. I'll go into why I did that later in the spoiler section, but I actually got most of the trophies back then. That said, I did unfortunately miss the Open All Chests trophy and I also missed a profile. Spoiler, it was Margarita. At the time, I knew I'd want to come back to this game eventually, so I left it at that, and I'm happy to report that I managed to get the rest of them this time. The big thing with all 4 Cold Steel games especially is that they are definitely guide games. However, like I said earlier, Cold Steel 2 is one of the most laid back. Since most of the overworld is available, you can backtrack anywhere you want, making chest hunting, fishing, and recipe collecting far more forgiving. Now, there are obviously sections where the game will not let you return, notably a handful of dungeons, but the large majority of the game can be returned to, which is important. That said, the absolute worst thing about this game in Cold Steel 1 is the character profiles. Throughout the games, you can talk to the students of Thors to learn things about them, with that info getting marked in your notebook. Which sounds really cute and it definitely is, but the problem with them is that they are very, very missable. Additionally, your party members have them too, with most of them being locked behind bonding events, meaning you'll have to do more than one playthrough to get them all. If you're wondering why I'm harping on these so much, these character profiles are probably the least forgiving missable in the entire Trails series. And I just wish they had an icon above the students or something, just some way to know that they have a profile available. I would appreciate it. In general, I'm not a fan of these profiles and unfortunately they aren't going away anytime soon. Now luckily, like I said earlier, you do not need them to get all the rewards, but if you do care about them, that's what New Game Plus is for. So as I'm sure you guessed, by my count you're going to have to play this game at least 3 times to get everything, especially since Cold Steel 2 uses the same New Game Plus system as last game, which I am still not a fan of. That said, just like Trails to Azure, this game features some New Game Plus exclusive content. Now this New Game Plus content is a little bit more controversial than previous games, but I'll go into that in the spoiler section. Now overall, I would still say that Trails to Azure is the most satisfying Trails game to complete up to this point, yet despite all of its issues, I absolutely love Cold Steel 2 a lot and I would gladly play it again. Now before we finally dive into spoilers, let's go ahead and rapid fire some small stuff really quick. Books once again return with Gambler Jack 2, the first sequel in the series. The first Gambler Jack was a book from Sky's second chapter set in the Republic of Calvard, and this game continues that story. Now personally, this was actually one of my least favorite books, but I think it has some fun moments featuring some race cars. The NPCs are the same as always, although I didn't talk to them as much as I usually do. That said, aside from the Thor students, my favorite is probably Pattery, who is probably the dumbest girl in Erebonia. She's a lot of fun. Costumes also make a return in this game, but with a really nice quality of life change. I mentioned in Cold Steel 1 that you can only change your costumes when the character is in your party, and that if you forgot to unequip them, they would keep them on during the school sections. Well, in this game, you can change outfits anytime you want, and it's great. There are also DLC outfits for this game, just like last time, with the DLC outfits from the first game also working here, which is pretty nice. One of the cooler outfits are these 10th anniversary costumes for Reen and Elisa, where you can dress them up as Estelle and Joshua. The Tales of series actually does this a lot, and I kind of wish Trails did throwback costumes more often. During a lot of the downtime in this game, I made a lot of use of the costumes, especially during Act 2, and I just think they are fun to have. The dynamic title screens also returned from Cold Steel 1, however they pushed it a little bit further this time. Depending on where you are at in the game, the title screen can actually change dramatically. I'm not sharing all of them for spoiler reasons, but it's a really cool feature. The games after this go back to just featuring artwork on the title screen, which is fine, but I definitely prefer this. In general, I think Cold Steel 2 has my favorite title screens of the series, and I'm really sad future games toss this convention, but I think it's a really cool touch and I really hope it comes back in the future. Lastly, I didn't mention this earlier, but if you talk to the trial chest when you don't have the required party members, then— oh my god, it's a chest message! Yeah, so XC found a way to sneak these in one last time. Well, if we ignore the fact that they localized Sky the Third after this game, 2017 was a weird time. When I first played this game, I thought I'd never see a chest message again, so this was a really pleasant surprise. Big thanks to XC for doing this one last time, but now it's time to move on to the main event. Alright, we are finally here. That's right everyone, we are now officially into spoilers. I'm about to go over the entire plot of this game, talking about everything I liked and disliked. This is not going to be a summary, but rather me just giving my experiences and thoughts. If you are interested in this game and you have never played it before, please go ahead and skip to the conclusion. I'm about to spoil what is, in my opinion, one of the more underrated plots in the series. If you do not care about that, go ahead and keep watching. Just be warned, some crazy stuff happens in this game and it has some lasting impact on the rest of the series. Also, to make things easier for me, I'm going to assume you guys have played the rest of the series before this. I'll try and keep it to a minimum, but there are some aspects of this plot that will be kind of hard to talk about without spoiling Trails in the Sky's second chapter, and especially Trails to Azure. If that's a problem, please feel free to skip to the end, and I hope you enjoyed the video. No hard feelings. Alright, is the cult gathered? Let's go ahead and talk about the plot of Trails of Cold Steel 2, starting with Act 1. This act picks up right after the prologue and is the part of the game most similar to the field studies from Cold Steel 1. At the start of this act, we learn from Valimar, who is actually a sentient robot, that each of Reen's friends are scattered across the Empire. Since everyone took the test with Reen, it seems that Valimar has their GPS locations, and additionally, Valimar can teleport us into the Noble Alliance territory, with the downside being that Valimar cannot use his abilities for a bit. So as I'm sure you guessed, during Act 1 we return to each of the various regions from the first game as Reen looks for his friends. Once reunited with Reen's classmates, Class 7 is confronted by the villains who make their introductions, and after a small fight as well as a mech battle, Reen returns back to Ymir using Valimar's power, where Class 7 prepares for the next operation. And this is pretty much the formula of Act 1 in a nutshell. While arguably repetitive, which for the record the whole series can be that way, I think the formula for this act is really satisfying, especially towards the end when you face off against the Noble Alliance, followed by a climactic mech battle, and it's pretty hype every single time. Now despite their ability to just sort of teleport around, I really like that Reen and friends are on the back foot during this part of the story. Reen and the rest of Class 7 are still relatively inexperienced, so during this stretch it makes sense for us to not be on the direct offensive. Additionally, it makes the stretch where we are on the offensive all the more satisfying, but I'll talk about that in Act 2. I also really like that Claire, Sharon, and Toval join you during this stretch, and that each section of Act 1 has a lot of varying dialogue depending on who you bring. Toval and Miles, for example, do have a very brief exchange, though as someone who actually read Ring of Judgment, I wish they had a little more dialogue between them. That said, there's a lot of other unique dialogue you can get, and I think that's really fun. Also, as I mentioned earlier, we get to explore the Spirit Shrines, and while I gushed about them gameplay-wise, I think it's really cool that Reen gets flashbacks of the War of the Lions. These are events that have been referenced as far back as Trails in the Sky second chapter, and it's really cool getting to learn about Emperor Dreichels, especially on this revisit. I think the worst thing about Act 1 is at the end of it. To compensate for many characters not being very available, you are bombarded with an absurd amount of bonding events in the last free day, to a degree that it took me a few hours to get through them all. Despite that, I enjoyed them, but it definitely slowed the pacing to a crawl for me. In general though, this act is mostly focused on getting the band back together and setting the stage for the rest of the game. Before we move on, something neat about this game is that it takes place during Azure's final chapter. Early in the act, you can visit the ruins of Gorelia Fortress and you can get a good look at the barrier over Crossbell as well as Belgard, which is really neat. As the story develops, you can see things happening in Crossbell off in the distance. This is really cool because it gives a progress report on where we're at in the timeline, so I'll bring these up as they happen. In general, there's a lot of narrative parallels between this game and Azure. While it could be considered lazy, it does serve a purpose, and I'm looking forward to talking about that towards the end of this section. Overall, Act 1 was pretty dang good, so let's go ahead and talk about the intermission. This part of the game is a highlight for a lot of people, and it's pretty sweet. After reuniting with his friends, Class 7 meets up to discuss what they want to do next, but in the middle of their meeting, Ymir is suddenly raided by the Noble Alliance forces, including Crow and his own Divine Knight. During this sequence, Rin finally has his rematch with Crow, where he loses yet again. Dang it. Defeated by Crow and with his friends backed into a corner, Duke Cayenne gives Rin an ultimatum: go aboard the Pantagruel or watch his home and friends burn. Given no real choice, Rin decides to go with them, leaving his friends behind yet again, ending Act 1. Alright, so personally, I don't love the setup for this section very much because it is a bit of an aggressive homage to Trails in the Sky 2nd chapter. In both games, the main character is trapped on an airship with the villains being offered to join them, and after that, the main character is given time to think in their room when a silver-haired dude walks in and ends up dumping their entire backstory on the audience. Now, I'm sure that they did this on purpose because Falcom really likes their callbacks.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
Though I personally speculate this might be because this was a 10th anniversary title in Japan, so maybe they were feeling cute, I don't know. However, I think the moment Crow actually starts talking to Rin, this section grows its own identity. Honestly, I really like how Crow's backstory is so mundane. It would have been so easy for them to be like,
he poisoned our water supply, burned our crops, and delivered a plague unto our houses!
No, for the most part, it's just him wanting to get revenge on Osborne for annexing his country and outsmarting his grandpa. And I don't know, I find that really refreshing and in character for him. He also brought Rin some fish burgers like he just came back from McDonald's, and I'm loving it. After that, you can explore the ship and talk to the rest of the noble faction guys you've been fighting, and I really like how personable everyone is, which makes sense as there is a chance Rin might join them, and we get a chance to learn about them as opposed to Ouroboros, who were the most evil people ever, in a way that you know Estelle would never actually join them, which by the way is not a criticism of second chapter, but more of an illustration of what makes these two sequences different from each other. During this sequence, we also reunite with Princess Alphen aboard the ship, and during the scene, Rin has a really big turning point for his character, partially thanks to Alphen. So this is where I get to talk about one aspect of Rin I haven't had a good chance to discuss yet: Rin's ogre power. No, not that kind, the Japanese demon kind. When Rin was a kid, he and Elise got lost in a blizzard when they were attacked by a monster. Backed into a corner with Elise in danger, something awoke in Rin as he blacked out. When he came to, he was covered in blood, with the creature before him an unrecognizable mush. This understandably traumatized the kid, with Rin developing a complex around his power. Convinced that Elise must think of him as some kind of monster, and fearing that he might hurt someone, he joined the 8-Leaf School to try and control it. However, due to him being unable to truly accept that ugly side, he eventually became an 8 Leaves dropout, leading us to today. Now, over the course of these games, Rin avoids using this power as much as possible, with it boiling to the surface in moments of desperation. To me, I feel like this form is very misunderstood by the larger fan base. Many people look at the surface and lambast that the form is just one big anime cliche, which it is in many ways, but it also serves as a manifestation of Rin's doubts and insecurities. Now this is partially from that Cold Steel 1 drama CD. God, I am so annoyed they cut this. But the term often used throughout the games, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, is a Buddhist sutra. Which from my research, and I'm not a Buddhist so feel free to correct me here, I interpret this being about self-acceptance. That the people around you, where you came from, your experiences, and the ugly parts of yourself make up who you are. This is frequently cited as the requirement for Rin to control the form, and as long as Rin holds those insecurities, he will not control it. Now, when you stop and think about it, this isn't too different from Kevin's stigma, where it was a power manifested from an emotional scar left on Kevin, something he only truly gains control of when he begins to forgive himself. So yes, in my eyes, I think it's basically the same sort of thing. Now, unlike Kevin though, the nature of this power is a lot more shrouded in mystery. Now, there is an explanation for this power in the future games, kind of. The only hint we have in this game though are a few lines from McBurn, lines that are said in the edgiest and vaguest way possible. Back on topic, during the intermission, Rin has a pep talk with Alphen, where he learns that Elise never feared him after that day in the blizzard, and in fact she really cares for him and wants the best for him, allowing him to finally begin to accept himself. After this, we get the greatest payoff as Rin makes a break for it, Alphen in tow, as this happens.
Rin?
I owe me being able to do this to you, Your Highness. You and Elise. Now, everyone who's done anything to aid us in coming this far deserves thanks.
What's happened to him?
Could this be your ogre power?
8 Leaves, 1 Blade School, intermediate level. I, Rin Schwarzer, will be your opponent.
I will enjoy this.
This is his ogre power? What is he?
Ha ha ha! Splendid! Simply splendid! So you finally conquered your power and made it your own, did you? You continue to fascinate me, Reed.
Green!
Forgive me, Your Highness.
What for?
You're here too.
You got some real guts, kiddo.
But you ain't getting past us.
Zephyr's guard shall not be easily broken.
I'm sorry about that, Your Highness.
I'm fine. Don't worry about me. Can I hold on to you a little tighter?
Of course.
Targets in sight. Commencing capture. Target lost. I may have underestimated you, Reen Schwarzer, in more ways than one.
With escape nearly in reach, Reen comes face to face with Crow where they begin to duel it out. However, unable to maintain spirit unification, Reen seems defeated. That is until help arrives. The Courageous comes into the scene with Class 7 on board, alongside my man Olivier and Laura's dad Victor, who is an Omega Chan swordsman, and the Radiant Blade Master. Also, he shares a voice with Van from Tales of the Abyss in the dub, which I find really funny if you know that character. And during all of this, Vita suddenly appears and calls off the fighting, allowing Class 7 and friends to make their retreat. And on their way out, Crow stops Reen to tell him something.
And if I might be so bold as to offer a word of advice, get Valimar a better sword, one like yours. If you think you're such hot stuff you can beat me without your 8 leaves training, you're in for a world of hurt.
He's right. Eastern blades like my Tachi are the heart and soul of the 8 leaves, 1 blade style swordsmanship. Alright, I'll take your advice. And when I've got myself one, I'll finally take everything back. The Academy, Elise, and even you, Crow.
If that's how you want it, I'd like to see you try.
After that, Reen, Crow, and their respective forces go their separate ways, ending the chapter. In general, I love the intermission so much. It gives us insight into the headspace of the villains, most importantly Crow. It gives a lot of cute interactions that go a long way towards humanizing the antagonist and pays off the Ogre Reen plotline, which is great. We also unlock spirit unification for Reen, where he can temporarily power up his crafts, gain status immunity, and powers up his S-crafts at the cost of 100 craft points, and it's amazing. Not as good as Lloyd's Burning Heart in my opinion, but definitely busted. Now that said, this stretch definitely isn't perfect. Like I said earlier, I'm not a fan of how similar the setup is to Sky's second chapter, and I think some of the jokes in the sequence were, let's just say, questionable. However, I do think that this sequence ended up being one of my favorite chapters in the series, and it's not even my favorite part of the game. Also, this wasn't in my script, but let's talk about Ogre Reen one last time. Now, usually when an Oni is depicted in Japanese media, it's a pair of them, one red and one blue. And while Crow definitely doesn't have an ogre power like Reen does, it is really cool that you can see that color duality represented with Reen and Crow, and I absolutely love it. Overall, great section, I know I'm not alone there. Let's go ahead and move on to Act 2. Just like with Act 1, this stretch of the game is pretty simple to discuss. Reen and the rest of Class 7 are put in charge of the Courageous, as Olivia and the adults go to Western Erebonia to help with the war. And during this act, Class 7 looks across Eastern Erebonia for their various friends and family in need of rescue. Throughout this stretch, as the nobles commit more and more war crimes, Reen and Class 7 step in to stop them, and in the process rescuing various characters such as Elliot's sister and Elisa's mother and Ruhr, while liberating several regions from Noble Alliance control. At the end of the act, in order to forge Valimar's sword, Class 7 has to return to the spirit shrines from Act 1, allowing Reen to catch up with Crow and eventually liberate Trista itself. That said, there is a criticism for this act I've never really been able to vibe with. This act is very often called filler by the fanbase, because while the setup is simple, there are a lot of events and gameplay in between these story beats. And I hard disagree with this notion, so I'm about to systematically explain why this section actually has very little filler, because I am petty and my work is never finished. So let's go ahead and get into it. Similar to Act 1, this act is broken into 4 segments. The liberation of Keldic, the liberation of Ruhr, the liberation of Bereahard, and the Shrine Hunt. Let's start with the liberation of Keldic. If we ignore the side quests for a moment, the liberation of Keldic consists of 2 mandatory quests and a single dungeon where we fight a boss at the end. Meanwhile, the liberation of Ruhr is structured a lot like apart from Act 1 where we have to infiltrate Ruhr on foot. Since we never got to explore here during Act 1, this makes sense and does a really good job of breaking things up. This eventually climaxes in a raid on the Rheinford building, the payoff to Angelica's arc where she fights her dad, and the death of Vulcan, all of which are pretty significant moments. Now, the Bereahard stretch actually introduces the Shrine Hunt. However, once you complete the first shrine, the attack on Keldic happens, leading right into the liberation of Bereahard, after which you can do the remaining 3 shrines in any order you want, eventually ending this act with the liberation of Trista and Thor's military academy. Like I said, this act is pretty snappy and is actually less repetitive than Act 1, since they added quite a number of curveballs to spice it up. Well, you all might be wondering why we have to go through all of this to liberate Trista. Well, allow me to show you why. I mentioned earlier that most of the country was under noble faction control as of the start of Act 2. Well, this is my rough guess of how much territory they've taken. As you can see, Trista is located right nearby to the capital, meaning it is deep in enemy territory and would be hard to approach without being pinned.
Oh no!
So freeing all of these regions opens up a pathway, and by extension works towards that goal. Overall, once again, everything in this act is pretty important, which I feel goes against the filler argument. Now, some will then point to the side quests, and there's definitely a lot of them, adding runtime to the game. However, those are still optional, and I do feel the plot should be viewed in isolation. Now, of course, there are also mandatory side quests, but again, that's also normal progression for the series as far back as Sky. Not calling that good, but again, it feels like a double standard because even Daybreak has mandatory side quests. I will admit though, that Cold Steel 2 is at times more gameplay focused than most of the series, which I don't think is a bad thing in my opinion, but it is worth noting. But despite all of my complaining, I would like to know what you guys think in the comments down below. This is just my opinion, and I know a lot of people do disagree with me. I will admit the good pacing seems to be pretty subjective within this fandom, so this isn't meant as a personal attack on anybody, but more just kind of me venting. If you disagree with me, that's perfectly fine, I'm okay with that. Now with all of that said, let's go ahead and get back to Kino. In general, there's so much I love about this act. The sections where we have to raid the enemy bases are pretty hyped, though I will admit that they do look very similar to each other. And we even got some fun moments, such as Nightheart's budding romance with Elliot's sister Fiona, which I thought was really cute. Now, if I had to pick a favorite part of Act 2, it would probably be the Ruhr arc. I love the train chase a lot, and the Followup stretch in the Rheinford building was insanely fun. And also, while people have understandable issues with Angelica, I really like the conclusion to her arc here. The death of Vulcan was also really well done in my opinion, and it's a really big turning point in this act's tone. The first Keldic stretch felt really triumphant, so this was a dark moment that really worked for me. I also loved the bonding events afterwards where everyone tried to cheer up Reen, which was really sweet. We also meet Schmidt, who is such a jerk, but he's really entertaining. Every one of these disciples has been such a character so far, and as of writing this video, I'm really excited to meet the Calvard one. The aftermath of the attack on Keldic was probably one of the darker moments of the game, and I was so glad to smack Duke Alberea with Rufus's blessing. Frick that guy. And honestly, I enjoyed the Shrine Hunt. The depths of the dungeons were a lot of fun, and I really like that you can do them in any order you want. We even get to see the conclusion to Emma's arc at the end of these, where she declares that she will follow her own path, which is just a nice bow on top if you followed her bonding events. We also learned Dreichels was the previous pilot of Valimar, and that there's been some sort of cycle with the Divine Knights, which will have significance later. Good stuff. The Azure Tree also makes an appearance over in Crossbell towards the end of this act to give us yet another update. The liberation of Thors was also the most fitting endpoint for the act, where we get to face off against the noble students from the last game, and therefore paying off the classism plot. I do want to mention that it is really silly that Toa is only playable during one fight here, especially considering they gave her this really cool gimmick. Basically, she has a craft that increases elemental effectiveness, which would actually make magic even better in this game, but no, she's only available in one fight, a fight that you can end in 2 seconds if you know what you're doing without even using her gimmick. It is very funny. Overall, I think I made it aggressively clear that I love Act 2. Between the gameplay, student recruitments, and banger plot beats, it's just a really fun time. And I'm really glad to report that the plot only gets better from here as we enter the finale. I just want to say the finale of this game was so hype, and it was one of my favorite stretches of the entire game, possibly even the entire series. I like that this chapter opens up with the students of Thors relaxing, since tomorrow will be the final operation. While the reformist army distracts the nobles, the students of Thors will have to use the Courageous to fly to the Imperial Villa and rescue the royal family as well as Reen's sister Elise. Something cool about the finale is that all of the students, including the nobles, are now part of the crew, which is pretty rad. Additionally, this chapter is a good chance to clean up any chests, trial chests, or cryptids you're missing, since once you begin the final operation, it's a fat point of no return. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's go ahead and get back to the very start of the chapter. For the first time in forever, you are allowed to freely explore Trista and Thor's military academy, and here you can have your final bonding event, talk to Valimar about Drykuls, and catch up with all the students of Thor's, and it's a really nice sequence. The next day, you can visit Reen's parents in Ymir for a really cute scene, and in this scene, Teo Schwarzer tells Reen that once this is all over, he'll tell Reen about his real father, as we get a blurry art of his real dad. There's also a New Game Plus exclusive boss fight you can do here, but it contributes nothing to the overall narrative. It does give a pretty broken accessory though, which works really well if you have Laura with a Murakumo build. We also learn in this chapter that the Azure tree has disappeared, officially placing us after the final boss of Azure. With all of that said, once you finish exploring for the chapter, that's where the fun begins, as the raid on the Imperial Villa is where everything goes off the rails. Towards the end of Act 2, we were introduced to our final boss, a red divine knight called Testarossa coated in some kind of evil energy. To make one last G Gundam reference, Testarossa gave me a lot of Dark Gundam vibes, being an evil force of nature being able to do almost supernatural stuff. Testarossa is awoken by Duke Cayenne, hoping to use it to win the war, and with its awakening, the Imperial Castle mutates, becoming the Vermilion Castle, causing chaos to erupt in the streets as monsters begin to appear in the capital. And with the stakes raised exponentially, Class 7 rushes to Heimdall for one last liberation. Fun fact, everything from here on out I did within the same 20 hours. It's the only all-nighter I pulled with the entire series, and I don't know how I pulled that off, but I was into it. I love the atmosphere of the Vermilion Castle. This is a dungeon that also appeared long ago for Drykuls alongside Valimar, and it just has this energy of an ancient Dark Lord's castle, revived after 1,000 years, with this epic song accompanying the entire dungeon, as the motif from the final choice blares throughout. This motif actually has the most appearances in this game than any other Trails game, and I think I know why, but for the time being, I am going to keep my secrets. This specific song is called the Phantasmal Blaze, named after Ouroboros' plan put into motion after the end of 2nd chapter, a very significant and fitting title for this track. That said, I think my least favorite part of this stretch though is what a lot of people meme on. As you ascend through the dungeon, as per Trails tradition, you have to fight the previous bosses, and I actually love this trope, but my problem is what comes afterwards. Every time you defeat a boss, the adult characters come in to distract them so you can move on, often saying the line, "That won't be necessary." It honestly got pretty silly at points, though it is worth mentioning that this wasn't a huge issue for me as I largely laughed it off, though I will admit it does get a little ridiculous during this section. Still, we got some fun moments out of it, such as Olivia and Toval power casting, which might be the scariest mage combo ever, Mueller making his grand reappearance and having a bro fist moment with Nightheart, and best yet, the Mick friggin' Flurry fight. This is allegedly one of the harder fights in the game, but boy, with how broken this game is, you wouldn't know it. Still, it's a cool fight with an even cooler cutscene afterwards when Laura's dad shows up. Enjoy! I literally felt like a kid watching Dragon Ball Z back in the day here, and I just love over-the-top crud like this. Funny enough, I think my favorite part is when you come back to the room and everything has just been demolished, and it's so funny and I absolutely love it. After that fight, we finally make our way to the top of the castle where Crow awaits. And from here is probably one of my favorite final boss stretches in the entire series. In this chamber, we get to have a mirror match against Vita and Crow, who have their own combat links. If you one-shot the fight, it's a joke, but if you don't, you can definitely get comboed by their link attacks and S-crafts, and it's pretty crazy. After that fight, Reed and Crow get in their mechs for one last rematch, with Reed determined to bring Crow back as the two duel until their souls burn out. Unsurprisingly, this is the hardest mech fight in the entire game, but if you know what you're doing, it's really not that much of an issue. Once Crow is defeated, all seems well, with Vita even curiously accepting this outcome. That is, until Duke Cayenne reminds us he is in the room. I neglected to really mention him until now, but Prince Cedric is in this scene. He's Olivier's little brother who got some screen time in the last game, but in this game he first appears in the same scene as Testarossa. Anyway, Duke Cayenne needed Cedric to summon Testarossa since it responds to Arnor blood. Additionally, Duke Cayenne explains that he's a descendant of the Mad King who lost to Dreichels in the War of the Lions, and that it's been his family's dream for generations to take over the country. Desperate for victory, Duke Cayenne forces Cedric into Testarossa as things get bad, real bad. Flaming wings extend off of the castle as a miasma descends over the capital. Reacting to the miasma, the people begin to fall unconscious in the streets, as Class 7 alongside Crow and Vita is forced to fight Testarossa. This is a two-phase boss fight where every single Class 7 member is used with Rean at the center, and it's a really cool fight. It's not a super difficult fight when you know what you are doing, but I really love the second phase's music. This song is called EOV, and it's a rendition of Cold Steel 1's title screen theme known in the soundtrack as Class 7, and it's incredibly fitting because this is the entirety of Class 7 against this force of nature. After backing Testarossa into a corner, Valimar and Ordine have recharged as both Rean and Crow enter their mechs, leading to this moment. I get to control both Valimar and Ordine! That's right, for this boss fight you get to control both Valimar and Ordine, and I really wish I had my reaction for you all, but I was screaming. This fight is once again pretty easy, but man, it's so cool having all of Crow's moves available. You even get a unique team attack for this fight, and it's just so hype, oh my gosh, I can't contain this. After beating the boss, Rean and Crow make a plan to save Cedric, reincorporating what Rean did earlier in Act 2 to save Scarlet. However, a sneak attack strikes Crow in the middle of their assault, but without much time to think, Rean pulls out Cedric, defeating Testarossa. After this, all seems good, until we realize Crow has gone suspiciously silent. And this killed me. Crow is released from Ordine with a giant hole in his chest. With no way to save him, he takes the time to speak with everyone, before giving his final words.
I can't go any farther now. But you can. So keep going forward. Relentlessly. Without looking back. As long as you do, I'm sure.
While dealing with grief, the group fails to notice Duke Cayenne holding the traumatized Cedric hostage yet again, as Rufus suddenly appears on the scene. Now from here the ending gets kinda crazy, so rather than try and explain it all to you, I'm just going to give you guys a truncated version, so enjoy the show.
You did come to help me, didn't you?
As a commoner might put it, in your dreams.
What?
Target in sight.
What are you?
Target restrained.
I see. It all makes sense now. I thought something was amiss about you from the very beginning. I just couldn't work out where you had gotten that girl from the Black Workshop. But it seems that all this time, you were just waiting for your chance, weren't you?
Oh, I get it now.
Milliam?
You're one too, right?
Yeah, it sure looks that way.
Now I get it.
It can't be. All this time, you were an Ironblood?
The group's primary member, in fact. Though that secret was, until very recently, kept between myself and His Excellency the Chancellor.
What is the meaning of all this? Why reveal this now? What could you possibly have to gain from professing your allegiance to a dead man?
He would gain nothing, which is why it's rather fortunate I'm very much alive.
No!
No way.
Impossible.
Gramps?
I'm pleased to see you again, Milliam. Greetings to you as well, Class 7. And to your esteemed instructor. And to you, Your Grace.
You! How are you still alive?
How indeed. Perhaps the years have dimmed your eyesight, or perhaps I had a body double. Whatever the truth may be, I think that's the least of your worries right now. All you need to know is that our loyal ally, Rufus Alborea, will be bringing the situation in Erebonia under control. And he'll do so with minimal conflict, while ensuring that the Noble Alliance's power is deeply diminished.
As obsessed as Crow was with making it happen, I had a feeling all along you weren't really dead.
Did you really now?
But I could never have predicted you would have taken a branch of the 13 factories under your control. What exactly do you plan to do?
Is that not obvious? I'm taking over that phantasmal blaze plan of yours. And my first order of business will be sorting out the mess you left in Crossbell. I'll allow you to leave this time, witch. Slink back to your master and the rest of that brood of serpents and tell them if they even think of trying to stand in my way, I'll crush them beneath my heel.
Vita? Wait!
I'm sorry you had to see me like that. Give my regards to the Elder. And I'm sorry for the trouble I've caused you all. Please, take good care of Crow for me.
You've all done excellent work. Icy Maiden, White Rabbit, Scarecrow, and you, Jade.
I don't imagine you intend to reveal your secret to cheating death, do you?
And rob you of such a splendid conundrum to puzzle over. Rufus, I want the situation here resolved within the week. As soon as you have things under control, move forward with the occupation of Crossbell.
With pleasure, Your Excellency.
Rean, don't!
That's really not a good idea!
Why? Why are you still alive? Crow shot you! You're supposed to be dead! But in the end, he couldn't avenge his grandfather. He didn't get revenge on you. Was everything he did? Was his whole life for nothing?
That's enough. Just as you have your reasons that guide your actions, so too does His Excellency. And I believe you factor into those reasons more than you might think.
What?
Rean, I pray you grow up strong and healthy. Oh, Adios, if you're listening, hear me now. Please allow this child. I see you finally remembered the truth. I'm glad to finally see you again, my son. You've grown into a fine young man. Indeed, the Empire will soon know of the Ashen Chevalier, the hero whose brave deeds allowed us to reclaim the capital. And who better to assist me than a national hero?
今別れの時果てしない行く先に僕ら約束を交わそう誰も
This ending. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and unpack these implications. Rufus being revealed as an Ironblood is probably one of the most fascinating twists in the game, since it showed that the commander of the Noble Forces actually worked for Osborn the entire game, meaning the entire war, the actions of Class 7, and much of the buildup were all planned by Osborn to strip the Nobles of their power. This also means that not only did Crow fail to get revenge, but Class 7 was also unknowingly used by this man, and to make matters crazier, Reen's real father was Osborn, a twist that is such a common trope but it friggin' worked. Add on to this that all of this undercut Crow's death, with this scene featuring a vocal version of Blue Destination called I'll Remember You, and it's just all of the feels. I also want to mention something cool. In Japan, this game featured 2 sets of credits, one English and one Japanese. So during localization, XC wanted to do something different. They told Falcom they wanted to make the first set of credits into a goodbye music video for Crow, to which Falcom delivered, even including never before seen art at the time meant for Cold Steel 3, and it's so insanely cool they went out of their way to do that. Toshihiro Kondo actually revealed in a recent interview that apparently I'll Remember You was created for another moment in the game I'll talk about later, but it didn't really fit, so they ended up making 2 separate credits to accommodate it. Or at least this is what I interpret from what he said. He was being vague to avoid spoilers. However, if this is true, then I'm so glad they placed it where they did. Also, this interview was actually super interesting, but do not watch unless you've played the whole Cold Steel series. It contains a huge spoiler moment visually. Despite Kondo trying not to, it's really dumb. Overall, this ending is a friggin' roller coaster, and the funny thing is, we're not even done yet. The following stretches of gameplay after the initial credits are probably one of the most contentious aspects of this game. I speculate that many people kind of burned themselves out on this stretch because they chose to keep going after the final dungeon, even though the game gives you several stopping points. Now, I can't completely judge because I did the same thing back then, but if you guys have any friends that are playing the game for the first time, please make sure that they take breaks because there's still a whole lot of game left. We begin the divertisement in a place that might be very familiar to longtime fans of the series, narrated by a voice that if you are playing subbed, you might just recognize.
青の大樹が消滅してから2ヶ月以上が経過していた。
In the credits of Trails to Azure, we were shown the Crossbell was annexed by the Erebonian Empire, largely due to the actions of Dieter Croy and his supporters. And now here in Cold Steel 2, we pick up in the autonomous state of Crossbell, now under the occupation of the Erebonian Empire. And from here we get to see Crossbell City now in full 3D, complete with several NPCs and characters we know incredibly well, and we now get to see their reactions as their autonomous state now becomes the Imperial Province of Crossbell. We also discover that Rufus has been put in charge as the leader of the province, with Grace and the Crossbell News reacting to his speech. Also during this sequence, we see Reen being used to fend off the Calvard army, wielding Valimar as a form of intimidation against the opposing nations. And after all of this, we slowly transition to the Geofront as we start to hear some familiar music.
あなた方が動いてくれるなら、渡りに船というものです。その言葉、今はありがたいですよ。インドの、いえ、リーシャさんもお気をつけて。どうやらかなりの手だれがクロスベル入りしたそうですよ。
ええ、こちらも耳にしています。ご忠告ありがとうございます。
それではお二人とも作戦の成功を祈っていますよ。ティオの指定した場所はこの先のエリアだ。行こう、リーシャ。
We get to control Lloyd Barrier Bannings and Ratio Bow! Oh my god! Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god. As you all know, the Crossbell arc was my favorite arc, and I absolutely lost it at this part. Now, I will admit that this is an incredibly risky move that could potentially alienate new players starting with Cold Steel 1, and it definitely did when it came out in the West because the Geofront translation wouldn't exist for another 4 years. However, in the present day where all of the games are available, I think this is an insane moment for fans of Crossbell. During this chapter, you explore a section of the Geofront, the most complex dungeon in the game. While I wouldn't say this is as good as the Geofront dungeons from Zero, this is definitely the best dungeon since that game, and I really enjoy exploring it. Now the downside to controlling Lloyd and Risha is that you don't have full control of their loadout, though I did notice that they gave Risha Murakuma, which is probably what I would have picked, so at least they seem to have good builds. Something I love is that aside from the lack of stun break and encourage, their moves are 100% accurate to the end of Azure, even down to the numbers on the crafts, which is a really cool touch with it taking place shortly afterwards. My man Lloyd even has Burning Heart and it works just like it does in the Crossbell games, immediately making him the best character in the game. Lloyd and Risha even have their iconic S-crafts, meaning I got to see Rising Sun in glorious 3D. Enjoy. I also adore that it plays the Geofront theme here with the battle theme replaced by Get Over the Barrier, and this whole dungeon is just brimming with fan service. In both ways, stay classy Falcom, and it's just a fun time. My only nitpick is that I wish they replaced the Victory and Danger music, but the game is easily modded, so I just did that on my replay. Now that said, I do have one small problem with this chapter. If you quit the game right after the first set of credits, the title screen kind of spoils that you'll be in Crossbell. So if you have any friends playing the game, stop them once they get to playable Lloyd. That way they won't be spoiled. At the end of this section, Lloyd and Risha finally find the computer room, where they have an unexpected guest.
そこまでだ。
Here we encounter Rin, who is now seen working with Altina, and this was just kinda heartbreaking to see in a way. After trying to do the right thing the whole game and losing Crow, Rin is now being used as a weapon of the military, and I just feel so bad for him. After a boss fight against Rin and Altina, Rin offers Lloyd and Risha a chance to escape, but right as Lloyd takes his offer, he stops to ask Rin for his name, to which Rin replies with this.
トールズ士官学院7組所属。いや。クロスベル総督、臨時部下、リーン・シュバルツァー。
While Lloyd and Risha make their escape, promising to get over whatever barriers lie ahead, Rin, on the other hand, seems much more conflicted.
リンさん、どうかしましたか？
いや、なんというか、羨ましいなと思ってさ。
Overall, as a Crossbell fan, I can't express enough how much I love this chapter. Ever since the ending of Azure, I was wanting so badly to see what happened next for the Crossbell crew, and considering that in Japan, Falcom would be taking a small break from Trails to work on Yseid and Tokyo Xanadu, it makes sense to give the Crossbell fans something small to chew on. That said, it is absolutely alienating to people who started with Cold Steel, and is the #1 reason I don't recommend people start with Cold Steel 1, which is this section's biggest problem. You're going to have people that will finish Cold Steel 1, see that cliffhanger, and then want to jump right into 2, only to get to the end and find out the Crossbell gets annexed, the Dieter Croy does a bad, which is a pretty significant twist, and for good measure get horribly confused on who these characters are. Now, I am aware several people encountered this and ended up enjoying the older games. I'm just saying it's not ideal. I will add though that for a Crossbell fan like me that played the entire series from the beginning, this meant the world to me, and seeing Rin interact with Lloyd was insanely cool to see. Overall, thank you so much Falcom for doing this chapter, I absolutely love it, and I'm so excited to talk about what happens next for Crossbell in the future games. But alright, with that we are almost done. I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. We have one more chapter to talk about before we're done with spoilers, so let's go ahead and talk about the epilogue. The epilogue is probably the most controversial addition to this game, but I am personally a big fan of it. Picking up immediately after the divertisement, Rin catches a train back to Trista, where he will be continuing his classes. Once he arrives, he has a heated conversation with Claire, since she had a feeling his dad might be Osborne but she wasn't sure about it. After brushing her off, Rin leaves the station where he sees it is once again Lino season, placing this 1 year since he first arrived at Trista. It's here that Rin is reunited with his classmates right in front of the station, as all of Class 7 makes their way back to the academy to resume their lessons for the day. Now this next bit is very poorly communicated, so I'll go ahead and fill in the blanks here. While Rin was out doing his missions, the remainder of Class 7 entered an accelerated program, meaning that very soon, all of his friends will graduate while he stays behind. In this section, everyone tries to return to their old school life and they all seem cheerful, but if you pay attention, there's something off about them. By the end of the chapter, it's made very clear that everyone is still dealing with the trauma and grief over the loss of Crow, as well as the impending fact that everyone will be saying goodbye soon. During this stretch, Rin visits Toa, who's asleep in her office, when she mutters Crow's name in her sleep, causing a reaction from Rin. Toa wakes up to see Rin shaken up. as Rin breaks down crying, apologizing for being unable to save him.
I'm so sorry.
The next day, Rin decides to help Toa out just like he did back in Cold Steel 1, meaning I get to talk about the gameplay here. This chapter is basically one last hurrah for Cold Steel 1's school sections, with this being structured pretty much the same as them. You can talk to all of the students, complete quests for Toa, and even get the resolution to a few smaller subplots. In particular, I love how we get the resolution to Kenneth and Annabelle's questline, where 2 of the Fishermen Elite Four from Azure make an appearance. We also get a quest with Anton later in this chapter where he asks for our help getting a date with Sharon. The funny part being that it actually ends pretty well for him, which I really liked. Towards the end of this chapter, everyone you played as across the entire game conveniently shows up at the school when something very curious happens. The old schoolhouse activates once again, just like the end of the last game, leading everyone to go inside to investigate. When Class 7 enters the old schoolhouse, they find the interior has been drastically transformed into something called the Reverie Corridor. In response to this, Class 7, along with their friends, decide to explore the old schoolhouse one last time. The Reverie Corridor is the first post-game dungeon in the series, and it's really neat. For one, every playable character, including the guest characters, are all available, giving you full customization and control, and this even includes characters such as Toa, Alphen, and Elise that were only available during very short sections of the main game, meaning you finally get to make use of Toa's gimmick, and it's awesome. And also, to reference Persona for the last time, this dungeon is structured kind of like Tartarus in Persona 3 Reload, only with a reasonable length. Every floor of this dungeon is randomized with random enemies, loot, and layouts. And every 5 or so floors there is a cryptid to fight, as well as a Zamirian ore to use for ultimate weapons, with every boss room serving as a checkpoint you can teleport to, and it's a very simple dungeon. Something really cool about the corridor is that there's a shop at the entrance where you can purchase these mirrors, and when you equip it on a character, it replaces them with someone that is otherwise impossible to play as. Lloyd and Risha, along with the villains Altina, Vita, and even Crow using his C moveset, are all playable. The downside is they each have an invisible build that is impossible to edit, but trust me when I say that you won't need to. The mirror characters are the best characters in the game hands down, and they are absolutely worth their very expensive prices. In my original playthrough, the first mirror I got was Lloyd, and no joke, he carried me throughout the entire dungeon. He is just that good. Overall, I know several people would say that this dungeon feels like a soulless addition that pads out the game, but for me, I kind of welcome it. This is the only place to truly get to experiment with the full playable roster, and it's just kind of cozy to run through, but I get that many people felt done with the story for several hours at this point, so again, tell your friends to take breaks if they're playing this stretch. Once at the end of the corridor, Class 7 comes face to face with the white version of the final boss of the last game, and here they are told that this was a hollow trial, never meant to be tested, no reward to be found. To which Rin responds with this.
Hollow? I hear it, but what's it matter? It's anything but that for us. We must and will defeat you. We aren't here seeking some sort of reward. We aren't here to find some hidden purpose. Overcoming this trial will be a fitting end to our time together as Class 7. And that's all the reason we need to earn our victory here.
This isn't about earning anything or some sort of revelation. To them, this is their graduation exam, their last outing as Class 7. And with that, the fight begins. And this is a real fight. If you don't use the mirror characters, this is easily the hardest fight in the game, at least in my experience. Now, of course, there are ways to trivialize the fight, especially on lower difficulties, but it did manage to give me trouble, and not gonna lie, that's the perfect way to end this game. After clearing the trial, everyone basks in the victory, accepting that the year they spent together is finally coming to an end. That is, until Milliam begins to cry.
Huh? Why am I...
If you did her bonding events, you'd know Milliam has never really felt sadness before, so seeing this really hits different for the audience. And shortly after Milliam begins to cry, the rest of the class follows suit, all the pain and trauma they bottled up in this chapter coming out all at once, as the class cries together, the spirit of Crow watching over them. The last scene of the game is after everyone has graduated. Everyone thanks Sarah for what she's done for them in a really wholesome moment, as the rest of the class all say their goodbyes. At the end, Reen sees them all off as he returns back to Thor's with a smile, as he begins to move forward relentlessly. And man, this is such a powerful ending for me. I know many prefer the punch of the cliffhanger ending in the finale, but this chapter put a spotlight on Class 7 itself, showing that even though they've returned to their school life, the events of this game really affected them. This aspect of the ending reminds me a lot of Return of the King's ending, where you see the heroes trying to live normally again, but now there's a disconnect. And seeing it all pay off in the scene where they all let it out together is really powerful, and is usually the point where I think many players, myself included, realize they've grown to love this class of goofballs. I know many have issues with this chapter, but I think it is a great ending, and it gives some good closure to what I would call the old Class 7 arc. Now, of course, there's one more thing I need to talk about before we finish this video, so let's go ahead and talk about New Game Plus. Cold Steel 2, more than any other game in the series, is one that really wants you to replay it. For one, there's obviously the New Game Plus system I mentioned before, as well as bonding events, but this game pushes it a little bit further. I mentioned earlier that you'll need to play the game 3 times to get all 3 accessories from the guest characters, as well as there being an optional super boss that gives the best accessory in the game, but on top of that, there's also the Black Records. For those who are familiar with the Ansem reports from Kingdom Hearts, these are functionally the same sort of thing. The Black Records shed light on the events of Erebonia's past, explaining the origin of Testarossa as well as the dragon he fought in Cold Steel 1. We also get a more detailed account of Dreikel's adventure, and it's really interesting. But now we get to the part that everyone has a problem with. If you collect every single copy of the Black Records and give them to Thomas, you'll get a secret cutscene where you learn the truth about him. In this cutscene, it's revealed that Thomas has been a Gralsritter this whole time, and yes, this will be brought up in Cold Steel 3. There's also some neat scene alterations towards the end. If you beat the final boss with the mirror characters on New Game Plus, you get a few lines of dialogue from them, and these are insanely cute, but man, Crow in particular really hits different. Now, I know a lot of people, understandably, have issues with unlocking content behind New Game Plus like this, especially the stuff involving Father Thomas, but I think I know why they did it. As I mentioned earlier, Falcom decided to take a small break from Trails after this, partially out of necessity since they had to shift development onto the PS4. In Japan, Cold Steel 2 released in 2014, while Cold Steel 3 released in 2017. Given this information, I think they really wanted to give players replay incentives to hold them over while they waited for the next game. However, in the current day, most Trails fans I noticed are very eager to slam these games out and move on to the next one, so the idea of replayability is not even a consideration for them. Personally, I love replaying my favorite games. It's partially why I'm still saying 7 games into this series. However, I also definitely understand since not everyone is willing to replay a 100-hour RPG. I think for a lot of us, if we put ourselves in the shoes of a hypothetical Japanese fan that was replaying this game sometime 2015 to 2016, I think they would welcome the New Game Plus content, but I know everyone's different. I definitely feel like they should have toned down some of this stuff, but I will admit that for the few players that want to do New Game Plus, it's some stuff to look forward to. Regardless, that's it for the New Game Plus content. Let's finally wrap this up. Trails of Cold Steel 2 is my personal favorite game of the entire arc. Now, I know for many they definitely disagree, and I have yet to do my replays of Cold Steel 3 and 4. However, this game holds a very special place in my heart. When I first played the game back in 2021, this game was the most addicted I ever got to a Trails game. Shortly after finishing Cold Steel 1 in October 2021, this game completely stole my life away as I proceeded to basically no-life the game for that entire November. While it was an incredibly unhealthy life choice that could only be enabled by the pandemic, I thoroughly enjoyed every single second of that mad binge. Between the combat, the character building, the exploration, the fantastic music, and a story that is simple but incredibly effective, I think it's safe to say that I very much enjoyed myself. This is a game that feels specifically designed for players like me that absolutely love the gameplay of the series. And while I know some people absolutely despise this game, I love it with all of my heart. It's legit on par with Trails from Zero for me. If you can't tell from the video length, I sincerely mean it when I say that I love this game. This sucker went on for a whole half hour longer than I expected as I just kept finding more things I wanted to say. At times I even began to question whether this was actually my favorite game in the series, which of course it's not, but man, it is dang good. I mean it with no exaggeration that while Second Chapter made me a fan of the series, and Azure gave me one of my best gaming experiences, Cold Steel 2 is when I became obsessed with Trails and I've never bounced back. If you've never played the game, play it. I make no promises you will like it as much as I did, if at all, but for me, I love Cold Steel 2, and I'm so glad that there are ever more Trails on the horizon. I gotta say, Trails of Cold Steel 1 and 2 have to be one of the most wild pair of games in the entire series. Cold Steel 1 is a school-centric RPG akin to Persona that swerves into a mecha anime in its final hours. The game also revamps several aspects of the series' core gameplay, and despite its quirks, introduced a lot of depth to the combat. Cold Steel 2 abandoned the series' chapter structure, giving you the most freedom of any Trails game up to this point, featuring a refined combat system that is just fun as heck to mess around with, as well as divine knight battles that are a spectacle to see. While previous duologies certainly had their differences in terms of pacing and feel, I feel like no duology has quite the differences these two games have. Yet despite that, I feel they have a weird cohesion together that I feel not even Sky or Crossbell has. In some ways, Cold Steel 2 very much feels like the second half of Cold Steel 1, and in that regard it made it really fun to revisit these games. Now, of course, these games aren't perfect, nor am I going to say they are for everyone. In fact, I absolutely could see someone that loves one game might despise the other. I definitely was a Cold Steel 1 hater before my replay. Additionally, I know this arc uses a lot of, let's just say, modern anime tropes, and that it will only get more aggressive with the sequels, but I hope I made it clear that underneath it all, there's a lot of substance. At the end of the day, despite whatever gripes I have with these games, I don't think there is a single Trails game that would not be on my favorite RPG list, and I am incredibly excited to talk about the sequels. That said, from here on out, all bets are off. I'm going to be assuming you guys have played the Sky games, the Crossbell games, as well as Cold Steel 1 and 2. Which also means I'll be delving a little deeper into the story for the next few games, so please let me know how you like that in this video. I could really use the feedback. But yes, this means the next up is the new Class 7 arc with Cold Steel 3 and 4. These games are some of the most beloved games in the entire series, but also the most divisive. The one thing I can definitely say though is that these two games are some of the longest ones in the entire series, so I'm definitely in it for the long haul. The last time I played these games was before I started this entire Retrospective series, so I'm really curious what I'm going to think of them, so I hope you guys are excited. Anyway, now is the time to shout out my patrons and Ko-Fi supporters. I'm doing this for both Cold Steel 1 and 2, so let's do it. I want to give a big thank you to The Slayer of Games, Infielder Seth, Notley, and Go to Sleep at a Reasonable Hour. I also want to give a big thank you to my YouTube members, and I really hope you are enjoying the streams, even if I do them pretty infrequently. Additionally, I want to give a big thank you once again to Snive for the game intro AMVs, Infielder Seth for editing a small portion of this video, and Kitty Hate Machine for voicing the Cold Steel 1 Misty segment, as well as my friends on the screen who helped me get this video done in one way or the other. You guys are all the best, and it really does mean a lot. I also want to give a big thank you to my community that's been super respectful so far. I know we're into real controversial territory with these games, but all the love and support really means a lot. This video in particular took an insane amount of time to make, way more time than any previous video, so I feel I need a detox for a bit. I'm going to change things up next time and cover something that's not an RPG, but I will for sure return to do Cold Steel 3 and 4. I just need to take a break from these Trails vids, I hope you understand. That said, we are now halfway through the Cold Steel arc, and next time are the long ones, so I will see you guys later with Cold Steel 3 and Cold Steel 4. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.